Okay, Sean, I'm going to go ahead and start then. My name is Brad Smith. I'm the author of BeerSmith and been doing it for, full-time for 10 years now. Been doing the whole program for probably 15 years now. Let me try that. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about beer recipe design. And I wanted to start this by talking a little bit about the early days of home brewing. I've been brewing since 1987, which is 33 years now, I guess. And in the early days, we definitely had some unusual problems with homebrewing. First of all, the level of knowledge was extremely low. It wasn't until the early 90s that a lot of the stuff, a lot of the actual techniques that we use today, a lot of the math that we use today, even simple things like estimating color, estimating bitterness, a lot of that research, Glenn Tinseth did the bitterness numbers and so on in the early 90s. And there's some consequences of that too that come into play, and I'll talk about that maybe in the next slide here. So because a lot of the technology and a lot of the knowledge we use for beer brewing came about in the early 90s, take a wild guess as to who was dominating the discussion at that point. Most of it was happening online, and the first web browser didn't come out till what, 92, I think was the first one. And, the internet really wasn't around until about 95 in any kind of widespread form. So the folks that were dominating this early discussion about homebrewing were primarily people that were involved. I see somebody else is up on the screen. Hopefully you can still see me. The people who were involved in that early discussion were all technical people, not surprisingly, scientists and engineers that had access to the early internet. And because of that, we have a tradition today that kind of keeps on, that the scientists and engineers have dominated a lot of the development of homebrewing techniques, a lot of the discussion, and so on. And because of that, we have a real focus in homebrewing on the deliberate, mechanical, mathematical sort of things, as opposed to the artistic end of things. And so I'll give you a quick example. John Palmer probably, wrote one, other than maybe Charlie Papazian's book, which was a little bit more fluffy. I should say John Palmer wrote the first book, of course, How to Brew, sold him out of his garage in the early 90s. That had a lot of this content collected in it, a lot of the technical content collected in it. Of course, John Palmer is a mechanical engineer. He's a very good friend of mine. Talk to him all the time. But he has a much different approach to brewing than somebody like Randy Mosher. And Randy Mosher, who wrote Radical Brewing and Tasting Beer and Mastering Homebrew, a number of other books. Randy is actually a graphical artist. So when I sit down and talk with John Palmer about brewing, a lot of times our discussion, dives into things like, how do I adjust my mash pH and get it perfect? And how do I get my, all these very detailed technical things done right? Whereas if I sit down with somebody like Randy Mosher, Randy's this discussion is going to go something like, Randy will be like, yeah, I cooked up some bananas the other day and I thought that would make a great beer. And there's some real benefit to that approach to homebrew, really, actually, because Randy is focused on the flavors of the ingredients and how they play and how they interact together. Whereas John Palmer might be a little more focused on, how can I design a perfect, porter or something like that, from a very technical point of view. So, I want you to be aware of these sort of these extremes, and be aware that homebrewing, because the people that have dominated the discussion, is very focused on the deliberate mechanical sort of approach to, I'm going to start with a style guide and I'm going to build up a beer, and, I'm going to look at 20 different recipes and build a beer. But there's another whole aspect to this, which is really the artistic end of things, and understanding the flavors in your beer is probably as important, if not more important, than getting the numbers right. And so I'm going to actually talk quite a bit in the next 40 minutes or so about beer recipe design from a flavor perspective. So there's a number of different ways to design beer, and we can talk about some of the options here. Let's see, I'll push myself up here a little bit so you can see the rest of that. But there's several different approaches. There's a traditional approach, like I tend to use sort of a more traditional approach, and I don't have a slide here for it, but the traditional approach to beer recipe design would be something like, I'm going to go ahead and decide that I'm going to make a stout or a porter. I'm going to look up the BJCP style guide. I'm going to do a little bit of research into porters, maybe go to, beersmithrecipes.com or another recipe site, pull down 10 recipes, kind of look at what they did for their porter. And then I'm going to, kind of average those and come up with something reasonable. That's a traditional approach to beer recipe design. My good friend Gordon Strong, who was, 3 times Ninkasi Award winner, BJCP president, Grandmaster beer judge, all that other stuff. He takes a slightly different approach. He'll take, like if he wants to build a porter, he'll use some other dark beer that he's already brewed, and use a ingredient set of, what he calls an ingredient block. So that's a collection of ingredients that he knows work together well. And so rather than starting from scratch, he will actually start with something that he already knows and then sort of adapt it to get the flavors or the combination that he wants. And I think this is a reasonable approach. You don't want to reinvent the wheel every time. You don't want to start from a blank sheet of paper. If you got something that works, why not just adjust it a little bit and make it work better? And then, of course, the Steve Jobs quote there at the bottom. It really, your whole approach is not coming up with something completely new. A lot of times it's taking 2 things that exist, the cell phone and the PDA, and smashing them together and making something new, So again, I'm trying to get a few different key concepts here up front. So let's talk about depth, how you get depth from the same ingredients. And so this is stuff that I pulled off the back of my Bisquick box one day when I was making pancakes. But, you got pancakes, waffles, biscuits, dumplings. They all sort of use the same ingredients, right? We're going to use a little bit of butter, maybe an egg. There's some flour, or in this case, Bisquick mix in it. And we can mix those together and make all kinds of stuff. We can make waffles, we can make biscuits, we can make dumplings, we can make shortcakes. Last night I made a nice pie crust, right, with basically the same ingredients, just in different combination. The key point here is, what all those ingredients taste like. You all know what flour tastes like. You know what butter tastes like. You know what even oil tastes like. And you got some idea of how those things work together when you mix them. Because you've been baking or making things for your whole life, making pancakes or whatever your whole life, right? The problem is you don't have that same expert knowledge when it comes to beer ingredients. And so one of the challenges here is, how do you get up to speed with beer ingredients so you have a good knowledge of not only what the ingredients taste like, but how the ingredients work together and create colorful flavors in your beer. So what I'm going to do here in the next, few slides anyways, is walk through the different ingredients, the 4 basic ingredients, and give you some general advice on beer design, and also some flavor advice in terms of how the malts actually fit together, how the hops fit together, those kinds of things. So here's some general tips and techniques for working with grains. One of the first principles in good recipe design is actually simplicity. If you go to like a professional brew house, you'll find out that they don't have 60 different types of grains laying around the brew house. They might have like 5 different types of grains, and they're going to make their entire lineup of beers using those 5 types of grains. And the way they do that is using this simplicity concept. The bulk of your grain bill really ought to be base malt, and you use other malts, specialty malts sparingly, but you use them with a purpose in mind. So if you're making an IPA, for example, the traditional English IPA was made with 100% base malt. You didn't use a whole bunch of different malts on it. Another concept, which I'm going to talk about actually on the next slide, is harsh zone malts. And there's a whole group of malts between roughly 70 and 200 Lovibond that actually have a very harsh kind of burnt tone to them. And you actually want to avoid those malts or use those malts very sparingly to certain purposes. And so I'm going to talk about those in a minute. The next one is flavor and depth first and color last. So you really should be picking your malts for flavor, not, how dark you want to make the thing or whatever. And, a good example is people like to use like 100 Lovibond crystal malt, right? To darken their extract beers. And it turns out that's a horrible choice because the 100 Lovibond crystal malt is right in the middle of this harsh zone. And you're actually adding a lot of really harsh tannic flavors to your beer. You can add just a tiny bit of, roast malt, for example, and get the color you want and not add all the harsh flavoring. So we'll talk about that. Another important concept is depth really comes from combining different malt flavors. So for example, if I want to make a porter, okay, I'm going to talk about malt groups on the next slide. I've got this nice color wheel, but if I'm going to make a porter and I want that porter to not be one-dimensional, I want it to actually have depth to it, okay? So I want it to have flavor depth to it. I don't want it to taste like roast malt or chocolate malt. I actually want it to have levels of flavors, and which is my favorite porter, certainly. You do that actually by combining different groups of malts. So I might pick I'll pick a nice base malt, but I'll also pick a colored malt to use, and then I'll pick a roasted malt to use, but then I'll pick also a little bit of malt from the harsh zone. And so what I'm doing is that by adding malts from different groupings, I'm actually going to create depth to the flavor of the beer. Does that make sense? So that's what I'm trying to do there. And then the last tip is just consider steeping your roast malts. So the example I use here is imagine making coffee, and you're going to percolate your coffee in a traditional percolator, and imagine percolating that coffee for an hour. Okay, you're going to end up with pretty harsh, pretty tannic flavors out of the coffee. And that's kind of what you're doing with your dark roast malts. If you take a bunch of dark roast malts and you mash them for an hour, right? So this is out of Gordon Strong's book, but he suggested you could either steep them in a separate tea, or the more modern technique is you just add them at the very end of the mash, so that your tannins, so that your really dark roasted malts are not giving you this tannic acidity. Now, obviously, it depends on the style of beer. If you're making a Irish stout where you want a lot of that harsh coffee flavor, it might be very appropriate to steep them or to mash them the entire time. But if I'm making something that's more mild, like a sweet stout, I may want to just add the roast malts at the end and not extract a lot of those harsh tannic flavors out of the beer. So that's the goal there. This is a flavor wheel that was put together by Randy Mosher, and it actually is a great grouping here. I'm going to just walk through real quick the different malts and the malting process. The basic malting process is you take raw grains, okay, and you take those grains and you get them wet so that they start to grow. And this is what they do at the malt house. You allow them to grow for several days until what's called the acrospire, which is a little rootlet inside of the grain, gets to about the length of the grain. And then the next step is you dry the malts in a kiln. And if you dry them at low temperature with a lot of air, you get a base malt. You get something like a pale malt or mild malt or a Pilsner malt, depending on the temperature you use and how much air you push through there. It dries the malt back down to about 10% content, and you end up with this nice base malt that we talk about, okay? If you take that same malt and you heat it up to a higher temperature, typically you dry it out first and then you heat it up to a higher temperature, you'll get the kiln malts, which includes things like amber, biscuits, brown malt, melanoidin malt, aromatic malt, and so on, which hopefully you can see on the chart there. And then, of course, if you take the same malt and you burn it, turn it up to 400, 500 degrees Fahrenheit or several hundred degrees Celsius, you're going to get a lovely roasted or black malts, which includes things like everything from pale chocolate to chocolate malt, the carafa malts, the black patent malts, all the roast malts that you're familiar with. Okay. And then finally, there's caramel malt, which is a little different. So caramel malt, what they actually do with caramel malt is they get it, they go through the same malting process that I described earlier, but they actually leave the malt wet, and they'll raise it up to approximately the same temperatures that you would use in a mash. about, what is it, 65 degrees Celsius, or, 150 some odd degrees Fahrenheit. And what they'll do is they will literally mash, it's kind of mashing the interior of the malt while it's still in the kernel, while it's still in the husk. Then they'll go through a process of drying it out and roasting it. And what you end up with is sort of a crystallized sugar inside of the malt itself, which is the caramel crystal malts that we're familiar with. And again, depending on how high you heat it, you can get the dark crystal malts, or the really light, carafoam malts, and so on. So that's the 4 basic malt groups. They all have a much different flavor profile. The other thing I want to talk about is this harsh zone. Randy was the first one, I think, to notice that, there's very few malts produced between roughly 70 Lebobon and 200 Lebobon. And the reason for this is malts that are produced in this zone have a very harsh flavor to them. They have flavors like burnt marshmallow, burnt toast, these really harsh tannic flavors, like sucking on a tea bag kind of a finish, if you will. And so one of the challenges you have, if you take something like, you take like your 5-gallon or 19-liter batch of beer, and you put a couple pounds of Special B in it, and you're going to end up with some really harsh flavors in that beer. Okay. So typically what I recommend is using these things very sparingly. So, if you're an extract brewer and you're working with, 100 Lebobon crystal malt, I'd recommend either pick something a little bit lighter or go into the roast black malt. Now, you can still use malts that are in the harsh zone, but you want to use them very sparingly. So if I'm making that porter, I'm going to use, like a couple % of Special B. I'm not going to put in, 5-10% Special B, because it'll just totally overwhelm the beer. But if I put in a couple %, I'll get, instead of getting this really burnt marshmallow flavor, I'll actually get this sort of, maybe like a really dark fruit flavor, like prunes, figs, that kind of thing out of it instead. So anyways, I wanted you to understand the basic wheel, and these are the basic malts that we have to work with. I'm going to walk through them real quick here. How are we doing on time? Yeah, we're okay. So this is a basic malt data sheet. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but it's kind of neat. Some of the, this came out of Breese, I think, right here. Breese actually has these sensory profile spider charts, kind of like you can get for hops. And you can access those online, and they're very useful if you want to figure out what is the actual flavor profile of this malt. What flavors is it going to add to my beer? So in this case, I think we're looking at a Breese pale malt, and you can see that it's, it's moderately sweet, moderately malty, a little bit bready, a little bit graham cracker, a little bit honey, but it's, sort of a nice neutral flavor profile. But they have, if you go online, you can pull up these sensory profiles for all of them. On the left side is the malt data sheet, and that includes things like the dry basis extract is actually the basis for how many points you're going to get out of this malt. So, for example, if you consider a malt has an 80% fine grain dry basis, that means roughly in a laboratory condition, you can extract about 80% of the weight out in sugar if you mash it perfectly and you get it out. Now, in the real world with real brewing systems, we don't get anywhere near that. We'll actually get, you'll actually have to apply your sort of brew house efficiency to that. So if you have if your system has like a 72% brew house efficiency into the fermenter, that means you lose, something like 25% of those points in the actual mashing process. Of course, we're not working in a laboratory. We're not crushing the grains into powder. We're not doing a lot of the things that they use to develop these numbers, but that's the number that actually drives the gravity estimates for your beer. A couple other things to look at here: protein, and then diastatic power and color. Protein, of course, is the protein content of the beer. Protein does dramatically affect the clarity of the beer. So that's something to be aware of. If you're working with a lot of high protein beer numbers, you're going to get lower clarity. Diastatic power is actually how much enzymes are in the beers for mashing. Not really a big concern for home brewers that are all grain brewing, because you've got plenty of diastatic power in all the modern malts. But it is an issue if you're working with partial mash brewing, where you might have just a couple pounds of pale malt and you got a bunch of other malt. You might want to start taking a look at that number and kind of, do I have enough enzymes to actually convert the malts that I'm working with? And then, of course, the color, I think most of you are familiar with. So we'll walk through the malt group flavors. Base malts includes pale, pilsner, mild, Vienna. They're kind of malty. They're white bread. They're cracker flavors. They may have hints of caramel or toast in them. So when you get to the Vienna, you're adding some caramel flavors, some toasted flavors. Caramel malts includes Carapils, caramel, crystal, special B. Carapils is obviously pretty neutral. It mainly adds body and foam. As we get into the light caramel malts, we're adding caramel aroma, apricots, raisins, figs. A lot of the traditional English beers use a lot of these caramel malts. And so you get the fruity flavors get enhanced. Of course, some of the fruity flavor comes from the yeast as well, but that's kind of cool. And then you get to the medium ones, and we're already, we get to the medium caramel malts. We're already adding these intense toasted flavors, burnt sugar, toasted marshmallow, dried figs, raisins, and prunes. Those flavors start to come through. So, I do caution people, don't go absolutely crazy with the caramel malts. A lot of extract brewers do, and it causes problems with the beer. And then, of course, you get into the dark ones, things that are in the harsh zone. You get these intense burnt sugar flavors, toasted raisins, Turkish coffee, a lot of bitterness, a lot of tannins extracted. Sucking on a tea bag is probably a good analogy here. So you use those dark roasted malts sparingly, and that's really anything over maybe 60 Levabon is going to be pretty dark, and they have a lot of those flavors to them. The colored malts includes Munich, amber, honey, melanoidin, and brown malt. Obviously, these are primarily used by all grain brewers, but probably underutilized in a lot of cases because you can get some great flavors out of them, and a lot of people are not as familiar as some of the caramel malts. But Munich and honey malts will give you caramel and cookie flavors. You can even make cookie flavored beer if you want to. Ambers, melanoidin give you more of a biscuit toasted flavor. Brown chocolate even, and the darker ones. They give you some caramel flavors, but they don't give you the fruity raisin flavors. So if you want the caramel without the, really fruity English ale flavors, you can use these. And then, of course, brown is right on the edge of that harsh zone. So you get the mocha, the chocolate, the toasty, some of the coffee flavors start to come in here. But, brown goes great in something like a porter, for example. Then we get into the roasted malts, chocolate, carafa, black, roast barley. A lot of people don't know that light chocolate malt is actually harsher than regular chocolate malt, and regular chocolate malt is actually harsher than black malt. Counterintuitively, you would think probably the opposite. But the closer you are to that harsh zone, the more bitterness and harshness you get. So if you're working with light chocolate malt, it's actually quite harsh. It's quite sharp because it's right on the edge of that harsh zone. Chocolate gives you more of a coffee sharp flavor, but it's actually more piercing than black malt. And then you have carafas, and carafas vary because you can get carafa a lot of times both in the husked and dehusked version. The dehusked versions are very, they take, if you take the husk away, most of the tannins, that sort of a bitterness comes from the husk. So if you get a dehusked carafa malt, it's actually gonna be very mild and somewhat bittersweet. And it's not going to have the harsh finish of a roast or a chocolate malt, for example. And then, of course, black is bittersweet, chocolate, coffee, etc. And then roast barley is actually different. Roast barley is actually a barley that has not been malted. It literally is just it's raw barley that's burnt to a crisp. But it gives you that dry, acrid flavor that you have like from something from a Guinness stout. Going to hops, tips, and techniques. Aroma is really the main criteria for selecting hops. If you sit down with a bunch of professional brewers, they will actually do a hop rub. They'll literally just take the hops out of the package. They'll smash them up with a spoon or something, and there's something fine. They'll rub them in their hands, and then you get your nose right up in your hands with the hops on it, and that's how you evaluate the hops. And I do recommend you do that before you brew beer because in a number of cases, I've taken, perfectly nice foil, encased hops and open them up and crush them and put my nose up into them. And there's something very wrong with them. Maybe they weren't packaged properly. Maybe they weren't taken care of in the field. Maybe they were, picked wet. There's a whole bunch of things that can happen. But, before you ruin, 15 gallons of beer, I do encourage you to open up the package and actually check it out and put your nose into it to make sure you're putting good hops into your beer. And if you're not working with fresh hops, go out and get some other hops. Most of us have moved to a single boil edition, and I'll show you in the next chart why we moved to a single boil edition. Whirlpool, steep, and dry hops is the main way to get aroma into your beer. You really can't get much aroma oil into the beer. And again, I'll show you on the next slide why. So most of us a lot of the major IPAs now are using giant Whirlpool editions, giant dry hop editions. That probably which is the best way to preserve the aromas in your beer. And then finally, aroma oils are going to fade with time. So your big IPA is going to have a lot different flavor in a couple months. And there's a lot of places like Russian River that will only really sell almost all their beer out of the tap room because they want to keep it fresh. And when you put it on the shelf and you send it to a supermarket, it's not going to be fresh anymore. And those IPAs in particular, disintegrate pretty quickly over time. Okay, so this is, let me move down here. So this is why most of us have moved to doing a single boil edition. And the reason is these are the key aroma oils, the major ones. It's myrcene, linalool, geraniol, humulene, alpha humulene, beta caryophyllene, and so on. Hopefully you can read that, but basically what happens is a large portion of the aroma oils in your hops are going to boil off literally within the first 10 to 15 minutes of boiling. And you can see for some of them like myrcene, I mean, within 10 minutes, 2/3 of the oil's gone. And myrcene is a major, that's sort of that piney flavor that you get out of your Northwestern hops from the United States. Most of the Northwestern hops have a very high myrcene content. So that's why most of us have moved away from so-called flavor additions. You don't really get that much flavor out of them. You're really just getting mostly bitterness. And you go to the Whirlpool or the dry hop if you want to preserve your aroma oils in the hops. I'm going to walk quickly through some of the hops groups. Again, you can pull up, these are off Hopsteiner, but you can pull up sensory charts, which will give you an idea what the flavors and aromas you're going to get out of the hops are. So I'll move up just a little here, but starting with the Noble hops group, this is, these are the noble hops that you think about from Central Europe, includes Saaz, Hallertauer, Mittelfruhl, Liberty, a number of these other Central European hops are used in a lot of German varieties. They tend to be low alpha hops. They tend to be bred for aroma. They're dry, they're herbaceous, they're minty, somewhat spicy. They have some citrus or piney notes, but not nearly as much as a lot of the American hops. So they're not really used in the same way, but they are used in a lot of German varieties. The Britannic Group, one of my favorites. These are English. I like to make a lot of English beers. Britannic Groups tends to be a lot more earthy. So they have earthy, woody, herbal. Some of them have grassy flavors to them. You take something like Fuggles. A lot of times you even get lawnmower flavors out of it. So they're really for making, these earthy, woody English ales that are, I call them kind of messy English ales, if you will, that have a lot of flavor depth to them, but, they don't have the clean finish that some of the European or even the US hops will have. But, these were used traditionally in IPAs. They're used in English milds, a lot of the English stouts and so on. East Kent Goldings is probably a defining example. Is one of my favorite hops to use, actually. But, you got Kent Goldings, Whitbread, Fuggles, Willamette, some of the classic beers in here. Cascade Group, this is sort of the group from the Pacific Northwest, and they have some distinct character to them. For example, the beers from the Pacific Northwest are all based on American hops. And because of that, they have these things called thiols in them. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But thiols give you a lot of these fruity finish. And these, a lot of the modern IPAs that we're making, where we get these big fruit flavors in them, the grapefruits and the citrus fruits, and a lot of these other flavors really come from not only the thiols, but the aroma content in these particular United States or Pacific Northwest hops. And interestingly, most of the ones that in the next group I think I'll talk about is the New Zealand, Australia. Those all have heritage back to the Pacific Northwest. And so they have a lot of the same characteristics. But you think about this is really the center of the whole IPA craze here in the United States. Almost all of them use these hops right here. The things like Cascade, Centennial, Chinook, CTZ, which is Columbus, Tomahawk, and Zeus. They're kind of a lot of times grouped together because they're closely related. Amarillo, Mosaic, Simcoe, Lemon Drop, and you can almost name the beers that go with them. Simcoe's used in Russian River. Cascade was used in the original Sierra Nevada Pale Ale. Centennial's used in Bell's Two Hearted, and on and on and on. So, this is really the center of the American IPA craze, if you will. And these are piney, these are citrusy, they're floral. They've got a little bit of spice to them. And if you use them in the right way, you can bring out a lot of the fruity flavors as well. So a very flexible hop. And I should mention, these are also used because they have such a high aroma oil content. These are used extensively in dry hopping and in whirlpool hopping. So the Pacific Group, this is the New Zealand and Australian hops, which are a little bit rare and harder to get. Things like Citra, for example, usually have to pay a premium for them. These are newer hops with distinct personalities. I mentioned they have a genetic trace back to the Pacific Northwest. So most of these hops were bred out of variants of the Pacific Northwest and then grown now in New Zealand and in Australia. One of the reasons these are in such high demand, though, is they have not only this thiol content, but they have a very high geraniol content, which drives a lot of these fruity flavors. So this is where you get a lot of the fruity IPAs, things like apricots, passion fruits, grapes, etc. And of course, some of them are named after white wines. You think of Nelson Sauvin, for example, is one of the varieties there, right? Whoops. And then one more. And then there's a final group of bittering only. These came out of in the 70s and early 80s. We started doing a lot of hops. We started creating a lot of hops just so we could literally for alpha content. And the reason is because there was a big push before the craft beer revolution. There was a big push by the big brewers to be able to do hop extracts. And so it became a game to figure out how much alpha acid can I put in 1 acre of hops so that I can get the most hop extract out of it. And then we can store the hop extract and we can sell it to the big brewers. So a lot of these beers have, fairly low aroma content, but they do have high alpha content. So they were bred for that. However, there's, a few of them you can play with still. Some brewers have been experiencing with using these for aroma, but most of them are used primarily for bittering. And this includes things like Magnum, Hercules, Warrior, Millennium, and so on. A lot of these came out of the hop breeding programs from the 70s and 80s. And then I want to talk about new trends in hops IPA. This is sort of that tropical fruity thing going on here. Let me see, I throw myself up here. So the tropical fruity flavors are driven primarily by using huge amounts of hops in dry hopping and in the whirlpool. And Stan Hieronymus did has pulled a bunch of recent research done into the roles of geraniol, linalool, and I mentioned the thiols. Thiols really only happen in the two groups I talked about, the American hops and the Pacific hops, really are the only ones that contain thiols. Traditional English hops and traditional European hops do not have thiols in them, so they don't deliver a lot of these fruit flavors. Not surprisingly, if you look at the top hops like Citra, Mosaic, Moteca, a lot of these ones coming out of the Pacific, they all have high levels of thiols in them. And there's been a lot of experimentation now with dry hopping during fermentation. It turns out if you take dry hops and you put some of these key hops that have these high geraniol, high thiol content, and you use them during active fermentation, usually near the end of active fermentation, because fermentation itself creates a lot of CO2, which bubbles a lot of the aroma oils out, or a lot of the aromas out of the hops. So you don't necessarily want to do it right in the middle, but a lot of people add these hops after high krausen and after peak fermentation, if you will. And it actually, the biotransformations lead to a lot of these tropical flavors. So there's a lot of people making IPAs now using this technique, and so I thought I'd mention it to you. Yeast and yeast techniques, I'll try and go through this quickly, but most yeast flavors can be off flavors, and so that's something to be aware of. And then I'll mention that yeast health is absolutely essential. What is that? Sorry about that. There we go. I went past one. Hang 1 second. Where was I? Went 2 ahead. There we go. Okay, we're back now. Yeast health is essential. So you want to pitch enough yeast. You want to hydrate your yeast properly. You want to aerate your yeast with the oxygen if you can, and you want to control the temperature. So, so these are all key things for your yeast health, and this is why it's important. This is off the BJCP score sheet, and you can see these are all the off flavors listed on the BJCP score sheet, and you can see about a dozen of them are related to yeast. Acetaldehydes from incomplete fermentation. Alcoholic comes mainly from fermenting too hot. You know, diacetyl comes from not leaving your yeast around to mature and clean up the beer, and on and on and on. So most of the serious off flavors are related to yeast. And then second is probably process issues, things like sanitation, oxygen, DMS, and mold. You really want to take good care of your yeast. Make sure you pitch enough yeast. Make sure you have healthy yeast growing. It really can create a lot of problems with your beer if you don't. I'm going to very quickly go through the yeast groups. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but English ale yeasts in general are going to produce a lot of esters, which are fruity flavors in the beer. They're also going to have lower attenuation, which means you're going to leave a lot more malty flavor in the beer. And they're generally fermented at higher temperatures, which gives you the complexity in the English beer, which includes a lot of fruity esters, you know, sort of a much more malty finish to the beer. And if you use English hops with it, you know, you're going to get these earthy flavors, and you get sort of this complexity that sort of fits into a traditional English mild. If you take the California ale yeast, like an American ale yeast, it's got much higher attenuation. It's fast fermenting, much cleaner finish, and that sort of gives you the clean finish that highlights a lot of hops in the traditional, you know, IPAs, US IPAs. You go to something like German ale yeast, they tend to be, you know, you can have clean ale yeast like a Kolsch that gives you almost a lager finish to the beer, or something like an alt style, which actually does finish much higher and accentuates the malty flavors. And then we have things like German wheat yeast, the banana clove flavors that form it's actually the clove flavor that performs the dominant flavor in a Weizen or a Hefeweizen comes from phenolics. And German yeast produce a tremendous amount of phenolics, which generates that clove flavor, which gives you that finish in the beer. You really can't make a German wheat beer without that German wheat yeast. Then we have Belgian yeast. It's really hard to say too much. You know, something like a Belgian wheat yeast has a high phenolic content, which again gives you that sort of clovey finish to the thing. If you add some spice to it, you end up with a nice wit flavor. And then there's a tremendous amount of variation. A lot of the other Belgian yeasts, the Trappist yeast tend to be fruity. They'll have phenolic, fruity, but they don't have a lot of phenolics in them, whereas some of the other variants like Saison will have a lot more phenolics in them. So there's a lot of variation. Belgians like Disneyland of beers. They have, you know, 100 different beer styles in a small area. Go through water tips and techniques. These are the 3 key points for understanding your water, particularly if you're a all grain brewer. First of all, it's important that you do a water test and you know what your starting profile is for your water. Ideally, you want to brew with water that's good enough for brewing. And there's a variety of ways to determine if it's good enough. If you put it into BeerSmith will actually show you if you're in the correct ranges. But each of the ions has a different range for it. And so you want to start with water that's good enough. Second of all, if you're an all grain brewer, you do want to adjust your mash pH. This is not something you need to worry about for extract brewers because the extract manufacturer is already kind of taking care of that for you. But if you're an all grain brewer, you do want to worry about your mash pH. You'd like to get it down in the 5.2 to 5.6 range. The way this works is if you start with water that is typically a little bit alkaline. So if you remember from your high school physics, you know, water's got like pure water has a pH of 7. Typically the water you get out of your tap is maybe a little bit higher than that. And then you mix it with malt. The malt is all acidic. And so what happens is the malt is going to lower the pH. The challenge you have is light malts are not as acidic as dark malts. So if you're making something like a stout, a lot of times you don't have to adjust your pH at all. because you're going to have plenty of dark malts in there. It's going to drive the pH down low enough and you're going to be good. If you're making any kind of a light colored beer, though, a lot of times you do actually have to manage your mash pH. And there's several ways to do this. You can do it with software. You can estimate your pH and then adjust based on the software. BeerSmith does that. A bunch of other software does that. The software is not perfect, though. So a lot of people will instead measure their pH. The method I use, which I think is probably one of the best methods, is actually to estimate your pH up front, guess based on the software about how much acid you have to add. And typically you're using lactic acid. It's probably the easiest for home brewers. And then what I'll typically do is add a portion of that up front. And the reason I'm doing that is I'm trying to get the pH down into the good range up front, because when I mix in my malt, it takes some time for the pH to settle down. And it may take 10 or 15 minutes for the pH to get to the point where I can actually measure it. And then it may take me several more minutes to get a good measurement. And, I got a lot of times you got to cool a sample down, put your pH meter in it, get a reading and so on, then figure out what the adjustment would be. By the time you've done all of that, given modern malts, a lot of times the malt has actually converted a lot of the sugars in the grain. So if I add my new, second acid addition later, it's quite a bit late. It can be quite late in the process. So I use this hybrid approach where I'll estimate it up front. I'll add a significant portion of the acid up front. So I'm down in the good range right up front. And then I'll make it a second adjustment if I have to, based on a pH measurement. And I think that's probably the reasonable compromise, because the software is not perfect. The estimates aren't perfect. There's a whole bunch of things that come into play here, but usually I can get into the good range up front. And then the last thing to know about water is the sulfate to chloride ratio, which is simply you divide the sulfate content of your water by the chloride content in parts per million, and you can determine how balanced your water is from a bitterness perspective. And if you have over 1, which means you have more sulfate, it's going to actually enhance the bitterness of beer. And below 1, it's going to enhance the malt character of the beer. And you can play with this by adding either sulfate or chloride to your water, depending on what style of beer that you're making, to enhance either one of these characters in the beer. So it's another thing you can play with, another variable you can work with. I mentioned, how do you know your water is good to start with? These are the big 6 water ions, and this is something you'd get if you did a brewing water report or a water test kit that's designed for brewing. You're going to get these 6 major ions, and they actually matter a lot more than the pH of the water. How much calcium you have, and calcium is going to acidify the mash. It's also going to improve the stability of the mash, and it does drive your mash pH, and there's the good range there. Magnesium is actually only needed in trace amounts. It does help a little bit during fermentation. The yeast actually needs a little bit of magnesium as a nutrient. Sodium actually enhances the sweetness of the beer, and it can be used to add body to dark beers. So some people will add a little bit of sodium to give sort of a roundness, sweetness to their darker beers. We talked about sulfate and chloride, but sulfite obviously enhances the bitterness, and chloride does too. Chloride is going to lower the bitterness and create a higher malty. And again, it's the ratio that matters here. More of a malty thing, whereas sulfate is going to create more bitterness. So you want to look at that ratio and kind of adjust it, maybe depending on the beer that you're making. And then finally, bicarbonate is alkaline. You generally don't want a high content of bicarbonates because it is going to raise your mash pH. You don't generally want to raise your mash pH. You generally want to lower it. But bicarbonates do enhance the bitterness slightly as well. So that's a quick summary of everything. I went maybe just a couple minutes long here. I apologize, but be happy to open it up to questions. I think if you want to go ahead, let me get get the screen up so I can see you guys here. But you want to understand the flavors you're working with, and then the other things that I'll mention here. Okay. Sean, I guess, do you want to take it over here? Hopefully you're still there.
Yeah, sorry. I've got apparently 2 different mutes here. Thanks. That was awesome. So yeah, let's kick it off into questions. Anybody have any questions? I know I have one in particular, but I'll let others open it up to others first.
Brad, I wonder if this seminar is available on the BeerSmith program.
I can post it for you on my website. It's pretty easy to do. I got it in PowerPoint format. You know, you want me to go ahead and do that?
Yeah, I've taken.
I'll make a note here, and I'll send the link to Sean. I guess he can send it out. Yeah.
Perfect. That sounds good.
Be happy to.
I'll also be posting this. Well, I'll have to figure out what media I'm going to post the recording on, but I'll have it likely posted on YouTube or something, if that's okay with Brad.
Yeah, if you have any problems, I just recorded the thing in full HD, so I have that.
Perfect.
Too. Yeah.
We'll be able to review it at that point. Good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Sean.
when you're talking about the water chemistry, what happens? Like, one thing that I've wondered is what would happen if there's if you have too much bicarbonate. There was a
Let me pull this up again. So looking at these big six, let's pretend the water coming out of my tap has too much of one of these. Okay, like too much bicarbonate. Okay, how can I get it down to the good range? Well, really the only way to do it is to dilute the water with something else, like RO water or distilled water. So if you have too much of something, you really need to dilute it with pure water or something like that to get that number down. If you need more of something, you can use the tool in BeerSmith, or there's a number of them online that are water calculators that let you calculate how much stuff to add. And you can add water salts to balance your water. Let's say my water actually here, it comes out of a well and it's pretty neutral. It doesn't have a lot of content. And so I actually end up building my water up using salts. The only thing I understand with the salts is you can't add one ion with any salt. So if you think about like, I don't know, table salt is sodium chloride, right? It's NaCl. So if I add table salt to my water, I'm going to add a certain amount of Na and a certain amount of Cl, no matter what I do. There's no way to separate those two, if you will. So what the software does, like BeerSmith does, is it'll do a least squares fit to try and get as close as it can to whatever water profile you picked. And it'll tell you what salts to add for that. But as I mentioned, it can't take stuff away. So in order to take stuff away, you actually have to dilute the water up front and then add the salts as necessary. Make sense?
That makes sense. So if we have the water report, we can plug in those numbers as your base profile.
Correct.
And then would BeerSmith tell you how much?
There's an option. There's an option to dilute. Yeah, if you go to the water profile tool, there's an option to dilute. So you can say, I want to add 3 gallons of my tap water and 2 gallons of this other, distilled water. That's an option. Or in the recipe builder, you can actually just literally add, let's say you need 7 gallons to brew your beer. You can add 3 gallons of your tap water and 4 gallons of distilled water, and it'll actually do the math so it comes out correctly in the water profiler. So that's how that works.
So we just had a suggestion that if people have questions, they could actually just throw them into the chat so that we don't get a bunch of people talking over each other. So, or
maybe you could just tee up whoever you want next. I'm not actually following the chat right now. Let me see. I can try to.
Right now, there's nobody in the chat. So
that's okay.
Do we have any other questions?
I have an 8-hour version of this.
Okay. Oh, wow.
That I do.
Nice.
I do that for Brew Your Own. We do a full day on recipe. Actually, I have 2 of them. I have a basic one and an advanced one. But,
nice. Craig Cumberbatch says he's seen a lot of regional waters to emulate beer styles that region is popular for.
Yeah, I saw him.
Oh, sorry. That was more of a statement than a question. But Brett Roberts.
Yeah, so, you're right. I mean, if you're making a particular beer style and you want to emulate the water from that, you can use the tool to try and match that water profile, right?
Yeah. Brett Roberts, if you want to unmute yourself, you can ask the question.
Go
ahead. Hi. He's not.
I think he might still be on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, yeah, we could hear you.
So Beer tried to make a recipe and trying on like one of the websites where you can build up your recipe, we noticed that switching between different grains, the alcohol percentage would really drastically change. I'm just wondering how you know when you're looking at a certain grain, how it will impact the alcohol percentage. Like why do some have just like a lower alcohol percentage?
Okay, I think I heard that. It was the question that some of the grains have a lower alcohol percentage and so on. I think that was it, right? And why is that?
Yeah. And
Well, each of the grains contributes. Let me see if I can switch back here. One second. Let me go back a couple slides here. Let's go back to grains. Give me a second. Here we go. So each of the grains is going to contribute a certain amount of yield to the thing. And so the way the math works out here is I take this sort of extract fine grain dry yield. Let's say I add a pound of pale malt, okay, a pound of this Brice pale malt, and it has the extract fine grain yield of 80%, okay? The way the math works here is I take that 80% and I multiply it times the weight, which is, let's say it's a pound, okay? And I'm putting it in a gallon of water or something like that, right? And then so I'll take that extract fine grain dry yield. Then I'll apply sorry, I'm drawing a blank here. It is the efficiency of the system to it. So if my brew house efficiency is, let's say 75%, okay? I got a fairly efficient brew house system and I get 75% out of that, okay? Essentially what you're going to do is you take the 80%, you're going to apply the 75% to it, and that's the effective number of points you're going to get out of the pound of pale malt. Does that make sense? And then it's a fairly simple formula to take that number of points and divide it by the volume that you're working with to actually get the original gravity for the beer. So that's how the basic math works. Now there's complexities that come in, like if you add sugar, sugar is actually super highly fermentable. And so sugar actually gets counted at a much higher rate. So if you're adding something like table sugar or brown sugar or something like that, it's actually going to be a lot more fermentable. And BeerSmith takes that into account and applies a higher rate to it. And then, of course, you also have the non-fermentable things like lactose. So those get accounted for separately. But the basic math is what I just described. You take the points that come out of the thing and you multiply it by 80%, and then you multiply it by the brew house efficiency, which is 75%, and then you get a number that you can easily work into the original gravity. Okay? Hope that answered the question.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay.
So you grazed over the yeast section pretty quickly in there.
Yeah, I did.
Yeah, I'm sure you go into more detail on the 8-hour one, but thanks for doing this. I was just wondering if you're going to be having more updates for all the different kveiks. Yeah,
actually, I just got a whole bunch I got the Lallemand ones in just yesterday, actually. Somebody put them together, and I've been able to assemble them, and I'm going to post those very shortly. But I know there's a number of other ones out there. Interestingly, you can add any ingredient you want. So let's say you're working with yeast, Crike yeast or whatever. You can go to ingredients yeast and just add your own and use the numbers off of the manufacturer's website. And you can do that with any ingredient. You can add your own hops, you can add your own grains and so on. I do try and keep them updated as much as I can, but it's a challenge with, there's hundreds of add-ons now trying to keep them all up to date.
Yeah.
Fortunately, a lot of people in the community will send me stuff too. So a lot of people will go and enter the latest whatever, and I'll just update the add-on, which is kind of nice.
Okay. Yeah,
and add-ons do get updated. So a lot of times they won't automatically update in the software. So you might have to uninstall the add-on and add it again to add it. And I try and post to my Twitter feed when I add new add-ons at least. But yeah, it's a challenge getting them all up to date.
Okay, if
you have new ones, or if you get a chance to enter a couple new ones, send them to me if you get a chance.
Okay, that's what I was wondering. Yeah, I've just got a bunch of the Scartman Labs ones, so I'll be adding those too, and then I could send those off.
That would be great. Yeah, and I can if you got a set of them, I can post them as an add-on or update the existing add-on.
Cool. Yeah, I'll have to look for that. Yeah, I think I'm using version 3 on my phone, but I still only have version 2 on my laptop.
Well, I try and post whenever I do add-ons. I try and post them to both. So I try really
Okay.
hard to get them on both sites because a lot of people are still using BeerSmith too, which is fine.
Yeah, still works great.
Questions?
There's another one an official one from Craig. Other than the sodium chloride ratio that you mentioned, are there any other ratios that you can recommend playing around with?
Not specifically, but I think I did mention somewhere here. Let me get to the. These are the sort of the critical ones, and we talked a little about this. So the sodium to chloride matters. The calcium bicarbonate balance matters only from a perspective of that drives your mash pH. But if you're adjusting your mash pH, it's not as big a deal as long as they're in this sort of good range, if you will. I mentioned magnesium really doesn't play much of a role in flavor. It's just more of a trace element. So when you talk about, playing with flavors, obviously I talked about sodium. You can add a little bit of sodium and enhance the sweetness, body in the dark beer. And then bicarbonate calcium, I kind of think of bicarbonate and calcium together because they both play a role in the mash pH. Although if you put a lot of bicarbonate in, you can drive more bitterness flavor into the beer. And then we talked about sulfate, chloride kind of fit together. So if you look at them, if you kind of match them all up, calcium bicarbonate are kind of a mash pH kind of thing. Magnesium and sodium are a little bit more trace elements, but sodium will give you some roundness, particularly in a darker beer. And then the sulfite and chloride, I kind of work together because they affect the bitterness of the beer. That makes sense? So that's kind of how I look at the big six there.
Hopefully that answers Craig's question. Chris has got a question about the acid addition for adjusting mash pH. If you add your acid too late, does that affect your mash conversion?
It really won't affect the mash conversion much, but it may, the problem is that ideally you want the pH to be correct for the conversion step. That's sort of your goal there. You're not as concerned about the final pH of the beer. It tends to work itself out usually. If you got the mash pH correctly, you'll get it. So it's really during that conversion step that you want the pH to be correct. And this is where that whole technique I talked about, let's see here. That whole technique I talked about that I use, and I've written some articles on it, where you go in and you adjust the mash pH up front using an estimate. Okay. So typically what I'll do is, let's say I run all the numbers and I'm brewing off a 40-liter system, and it says I got to add like 15 milliliters of lactic acid in order to get to my mash pH. Okay. That's what the software tells me, right? So what I might do is I might add like 10 of that. And if I add 10 milliliters of it, I have pretty good confidence that even if the estimate's off and things aren't perfect, I'll add that up front before I add the malt, literally. And I have pretty good confidence that I'll be in the good range. I'll still be in that 5.2 to 5.6 range. Okay. And then after I mashed in, and again, it takes several minutes to dough in and everything. And all these malts we're working with now have a very high enzyme content, which means that they convert very, very quickly. So this is why I recommend using this method, because you want that conversion that's taking place even as you're mashing and mixing and getting the dough balls out of the thing and all that stuff. It's already starting to convert because there's so many enzymes in these modern malts. So you want the mash pH to be roughly correct then. So that's why I add that acid up front. And then what I'll do is after I've got everything mashed in and mixed it all in, I'll take another mash reading using a pH meter, and maybe I'll make a final adjustment to get exactly where I want. So, I tend to, like, if I'm working with a lot of lighter beers, this is just personal preference, but I like to drive the mash pH down a little bit lower, particularly for when I'm working with lagers or very light beers. So I'll drive it down closer to 5.2. If I'm working with a darker beer, a lot of those off flavors that you might get or stability issues that you might get from working with the wrong mash pH don't matter as much with a darker beer because they're going to be hidden by the roast malt flavors and so on. But if I'm working with a subtle light beer, a lot of times I'll try and drive that pH down. So I use that second adjustment to get it exactly where I want. So that's the method I use. I think it's probably the best way to go, really, because it's impossible to get it perfect up front, but you can at least get it in the ballpark up front, and that most of that mash conversion is happening at the right pH.
In a pinch, can lemon juice be? Sorry, I'm just reading Kevin's question. Can lemon be used as an acid addition?
I haven't heard of lemon juice being used. I've heard of citric acid being used, and some commercial brewers even use citric acid. I don't have it in the BeerSmith calculator to calculate citric acid. You can find calculators online that'll do it though, and get you into the ballpark. So I don't know. I haven't used lemon juice. I primarily use lactic acid because it's just easy to get. Some people use phosphoric acid. You can use acid malt. Acid malt is effectively the same thing though. Because acid malt is really just soured malt, if you will. And so it has lactic acid in it. They allow it to sour naturally. It's used in German brewing because, they have the Reinheitsgebot, which is a law that prevents them from using, anything but the 4 basic ingredients. But acid malt's the same thing. So, and then some commercial brewers even use sulfuric acid and hydrochloric acid. I don't really recommend that for home use because they're kind of caustic and hard to work with, but you can do what you want, I guess. Other questions? Sorry.
This one's for me. The BU-GU ratio. Is there a calculator in BeerSmith for that?
Yeah, that'll show up. It shows up as a bitterness ratio, and I think you can add it to the custom fields there if it's not already there. In in that bottom corner where you can pick the custom fields on the main design screen, you can add the BU to GU. I think it's actually called the bitterness ratio in BeerSmith, but it's exactly what you described. It's just the bitterness over the gravity, right? And that is useful as a design tool. Yeah, I didn't talk about it much here, but.
So there's certain styles that would gravitate to certain ratios. Then is that kind of the idea?
If you go online, I've written some articles. In fact, maybe some of you guys are on the newsletter. I published an index to all of my articles now, which you can actually access. It's 360 articles on beer brewing. I think I indexed, and then that was last weekend, and then the weekend this past week I published an index to all 212 podcasts. So you can find those. If you go to beersmith.com/blog, I think you can find links to both of those near the top because I wrote short articles on them. But yeah, I have an article on exactly what you were just describing on the bitterness ratio. And I think I broke down a number of common styles and sort of where they fall in terms of bitterness ratio. You can estimate the bitterness ratio for the style also just by dividing, the bitterness by the gravity for the averages for the style and get an idea of where they should fall. So it gives you a good idea.
Cool. Are there any further questions? I think there'll be the last call for questions. Is magnesium essential? Ken uses reverse osmosis water, and how do you add?
You only need a very trace amount of magnesium, and I think I got it here somewhere. Hang on, go up a slide or two. You only need about, you can see it here, 10 parts per million, and it's really just a trace nutrient for fermentation. If you had a wort with no magnesium in it, would it probably ferment out fine? Yeah, it probably would. But generally, you want a little bit trace cement. And the easiest way to add that, I think, is with Epsom salts. I think have magnesium in them. So you really just need like a very tiny amount of Epsom salt, I think will get you into where you want to be. 10 parts per million. Okay.
Sounds good. Last call for questions. If you steep some grains, do you add any extra grains to mash to get more sugar?
Generally not, because I assume you're talking about steeping grains at the end of the mash, probably. That's my guess anyways.
That would be my guess.
Keeping grains for extract. But let's say you're using that method where I talked about adding grains at the very end of the mash, for example. Okay. Well, it turns out that if you take like dark roasted grains, they actually have almost no fermentables in them. And if you think about that, that kind of makes sense. They have no enzymes in them, for example, but they have almost no fermentables in them. So basically you're adding non-fermentables to your beer. So the fact that you add them at the very end of the mash doesn't really matter because there's really no conversion going on there. That's the answer to that.
All right. Well, I think that that does it. We're pretty much, I think, just past the end of our time. But I'm sorry, just one quick question, I guess, just popped up.
I think I saw it pop up. Yeah, 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Oh, is 5 minutes enough? So typically what I'll do is end it at the end of the spar. I'm sorry, not the end of the sparge, at the end of the mash. So yeah, 5 minutes is probably plenty, because you also have to count that grain's going to be in there during the whole time that you're sparging. So, if it takes me 20 or 25 minutes to sparge out my batch, I'm still running hot water through those grains. So there's still plenty of time to extract the flavor. Okay. Hey, thank you, Sean, for inviting me. I really appreciate you having me here. And I guess we'll do it again in a couple of weeks, maybe.
Yeah, May 2nd, 1 p.m., same time.
Write that down.
Thank you very much for agreeing to do this. This is awesome. I know you have a lot of demands on your time, especially with the quarantine, and a bunch of clubs around North America, probably worldwide, are wanting to do stuff like this as well. So it's very much appreciated by us and our members to have you here and taking the time to do this for us. And
my pleasure.
To do it again in a couple of weeks.
I'm trying to decide how many of these I can do. I all of a sudden, I just, I used to do like one of these every 1 or 2 of these a month. And now all of a sudden I'm getting like 5 and 10 clubs a week coming in and going, happy to do it for you guys. Awesome. I mentioned I was up to Winnipeg a couple of years ago, really enjoyed it there. We went to a baseball game and hung out downtown. It was a lot of fun. So
nice.
Stay warm though. I guess it's still cold up there, huh?
Yeah, well, we had a few snowflakes in the air, but it's mostly rain right now. Well, actually, looking out the window, it seems to have held off for a bit. So, yeah.
Well, everybody stay safe, and hopefully this quarantine thing will come to an end at some point here shortly. I hope.
For sure.
Stay safe, and I'll see you guys in a couple weeks, okay?
Yeah, for sure. We'll see you guys. For anybody else on the call, if you want to hang out and chat, I'm going to be around for a while. I'm just going to turn the recording off so that we're not recording the chat. But yeah, thanks again, Brad, and we'll see you in a